Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton, aka Possibilityman. We're committed to bringing you guests who strive to better people's lives and serve as a force for good in the world. Our guest today is Reuben Keith Green. He served 22 years in the United States Navy. He started his career as an enlisted sailor and went on to officer candidate school, where he was commissioned in 1984. Lieutenant Commander Green served 4 consecutive sea tours before his final one ashore. He is the author of a new book, Black Officer, White Navy. Lieutenant Commander Green, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, and please call me Keith.
Okay, will do, will do. Hey, I'm looking forward to talk with you, but first, this announcement to our listeners and our viewers: follow, like, and share this podcast wherever you find it. Your support matters and is appreciated. Hey, Keith, I've been looking forward to talk with you for a very long time, and I wanted to wait until February because in the United States, we celebrate Black History Month. And so I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about having a month reserved to emphasize Black history?
I think that's a great idea. Black History Month started out as Black History Week. Carter G. Woodson was the founder of that, and I've been interested in Black history since I was a little kid. So it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart.
What do you think prompted you to become interested in Black history as a child?
Well, when I was a little kid, I was a nerd. I loved to read, and I talked my parents into buying me a set of encyclopedias that they couldn't afford. You know, they had 5 mouths to feed and a dog. So I was bugging them for these encyclopedias. And when they bought me the encyclopedias, I was living in San Diego, and I noticed that there weren't any Black people in the encyclopedias, or very few. You might see an occasional African dressed in traditional garb or whatever, but there are very few Black people. So then I pestered them to start buying me some books on Black history because I would read
Uh-huh.
Ebony and Jet magazine and I would get these little tidbits. So I talked them into buying me some of the Lerone Bennett Jr. books that were put out
Yeah.
by Johnson Publishing Company. And then that led me into some other things. So I've been interested in Black history since I was a little kid. And when I joined the Navy at 17, I think I was 18 years old when I took the CLEP exam on African American history. And I scored in the 97th percentile. So I
Wow.
had learned a lot along the way.
That's impressive. But it's 2024 now. There is still some controversy about Black History Month. Some individuals, I'm not going to name them, some famous actors, for example, have said they don't believe that there should be a month to underscore Black history. They say, look, every day is Black history, every day, just like every day is American history. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my thoughts about that are: do they feel the same way about Cinco de Mayo? Do they feel the
Oh,
same way about St. Patrick's Day? I mean, I think a lot of people take issue with highlighting Black achievement and accomplishment, not really understanding how that is woven into uh, uh, everyday society. So many
yeah,
people don't realize that the stoplight that they stop in front of every day was invented by a Black man. The
yeah.
filament in the first light bulb was invented by a Black man. You know, George Washington Carver created hundreds of products from peanuts, and he was a Black man. So I think highlighting Black History Month is a way of showing people how integral Black history is and Black achievement is to their own life.
Yeah, that's a great response. You said something that I have never considered until you said it. You said in the United States we recognize St. Patrick's Day, and it's a big thing here. People have celebrations. They're dressed in green. They do all kinds of things, and rarely do I hear complaints about St. Patrick's Day. That's a great observation, Keith. Yeah. Hey, Keith. So where did you grow up in the United States?
Well, my father was a sailor. So by the time I started third grade, I was born in Tennessee, lived in Florida, Virginia, Rhode Island, Tennessee, and then moved to California. And that's why I started third grade. I say that I grew up in California because I was there from third grade until I finished junior high school. I left there when I graduated from junior high school. ninth grade, we moved back to Tennessee. My mother and father had gotten divorced. So I grew up in California, and then I spent the next 3 years in Tennessee for a year and a half, and then in Florida for a year, maybe a year and a half, and then I joined the Navy from Florida. So by the time I was 18, I'd gone to 4 different high schools.
Okay. Now you mentioned your father a moment ago. I want to come back to that in a minute. But now I looked into your bio and you indicated that you dropped out of high school. I mean, firstly, what was your high school experience like?
Well, when I moved to Tennessee from California, it was like landing on another planet. I went from a very multicultural, diverse environment to a school in Tennessee where there were 5 Black guys in the school, and I was related to one was my brother, and the other 3 were cousins. So there just
Okay.
weren't any Black people there. So that was quite a shock. After spending a year and a half there, and by the way, in high school was where I learned how to deal with bullies, because having left California, I didn't have that issue. But once I got into a majority white environment, no Hispanics, just a smattering of Black people, and then a few white people. Mm-hmm. So I left there and moved to Florida, which was a bit more diverse, but it was kind of segregated. I mean, I went to an integrated high school, but it was much more segregated than what I was accustomed to, even after Tennessee. So, but I quit high school my senior year. I was 17 and knew everything, but I was a smart kid, but I was in the kind of the dead end Florida school system. I had no real opportunities for scholarships or anything. My grades, when I moved to Florida, I was taking algebra classes and I was making A's in Tennessee, but I moved in the middle of the school year. When I got to Florida, I was in the same classes, but I was, a different school system, different setup. And I was trying to ask the teachers some things about, I don't quite get this right here. Can you help me with it? And they just kind of blew me off. I was usually the only Black person in those advanced classes. So I realized things had changed, and I just kind of gave up on the school system. But when I took an exam my junior year, and I scored very well, and the guidance counselor called me in and said, have you thought about going to college? You have these fantastic scores, et cetera, et cetera. And by then I was thoroughly disgusted. I said, lady, I'll be lucky if I make it out of high school. I was reading at a 2-year college level, but flunking English. And that was just because I had just become disinterested in school. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do the rest of my life.
That's pretty interesting. Here you were a smart kid. Here you are a smart man, doing well, but yet school, somehow you lost interest. Now, I want to share more about that, about just losing interest in school. Was it because of the teachers? Was it because of the environment, or a combination of things?
It was a combination of that, because once I got into Florida and started into the school system, I saw how Black people were pretty much shunted into the non-academic courses, and it wasn't a very rigorous environment. And me being a nerd, I'm trying to learn as much as I can, and my peers sort of discouraged that as well. I didn't have any friends, and I was not like a lot of the other people who didn't much care about school. Education was not highly valued. And then the people who were teaching did not value people like me who had potential but was the wrong color. So it was a gradual process. And then once I started working part-time in the evenings, making some money became more important to me than having good grades in algebra.
I see. Now, your father was a sailor, a career guy. About how many years did he serve?
My father served almost 18 years total. He was in the Army. He joined when he was 17 and became a paratrooper. Wow. He became a paratrooper. He served in Korea. And then I don't know at what point he left the Army and joined the Navy, but he spent about 15 or 16 years in the Navy. And then he left under less than ideal circumstances. And he did not want me to join the Navy because he said the Navy was too racist.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. So even though he had served a career in the military, he just didn't want you to go into the Navy.
That's correct. I had been reading the newspaper and reading about Admiral Sam Gravely, who had been promoted to admiral, the first Black man to become an admiral in the Navy. And I was fascinated by this guy named Zumwalt, the CNO, from 70 to 74. And he was just very outspoken about how Black people had gotten a raw deal in the Navy, and he was going to fix that,
Mhm.
and he did. For the most part, he changed that. But my
Uh-huh.
father, prior to, I didn't know this until just a few years ago, a couple years ago. But my father got out of the Navy. Um, he only had less than 18 months to complete his retirement. He chose to leave the Navy rather than spend another day in that environment. And I didn't learn
Mm.
until then, I got his records 30 years after he died, that he had gone to captain's mast, non-judicial punishment, for inciting a riot on board a naval vessel. That's the same thing that the people who were charged with the Kitty Hawk disturbances in 1972 and 73, they were all
Mm.
charged with that. None of them were convicted because they were fighting the very same kind of racism that my father was fighting.
Mm.
And the typical result back then was to punish the people that were complaining about how they were treated.
Uh-huh. But yet still you decided to join the Navy. How did you make that decision? Well, after all, you heard about the Navy as a racist institution, but yet you got in there. Why is that?
It was primarily driven by my belief in what I was hearing from Admiral Zumwalt. He said
Uh-huh.
that the Navy there was no black Navy, there was no white Navy, there was just one Navy. And of course, they were advertising heavily in black publications like Ebony and Jet, whatnot. And I would read those advertisements say you can be black in Navy too. And I thought, well, I'm
Yeah.
black, and if the Navy's got room for me, I'll give it
Yeah.
a shot. So I went
Yeah.
down
Yeah.
and took the exam to come in the Navy, and the recruiters weren't all that happy to see me. I was a high school dropout with a big afro and wearing glasses, and but once I completed the entrance exam, they were a lot happier to see me. I didn't know this until 30 years after I took the test, but I had scored in the uh, top 5% of any black person that took that exam for that year, and in the top 30% of all people that applied that year. So I was a prime catch for them. I wasn't in the
Mm-hmm.
highest educational category, but for high school dropout, I was the cream of the crop.
Yeah. And then, you entered as a non-commissioned officer. Were you thinking about a career when you first entered the Navy?
Yes, I was. I was a little bit hesitant, but I wanted to give it a shot and see what
Mhm.
happened after my first 4-year hitch. But I joined as a
Yeah.
reservist because my father said, what he said. I said, okay, they have a program that you can go to a school, a technical
Mhm.
school, and then go in the reserves for 4 or 6 years, and you could always come into regular active duty from the reserves.
Mhm.
I figured I could put up with one weekend a month. And get a feel for it if that's what it took. And so I went to Miami A School in Charleston, South Carolina, and only 5% of blacks who entered the Navy that year went to a technical school.
Mhm. And did you decide to finish your high school education at that point, or did that come later?
That came within about a year after I'd finished A
Mhm.
School and went to my reserve unit, came back on active duty. Um, I went through what's called the pre-discharge education program in Charleston, South Carolina. Stall High School is
Mhm.
what my diploma says. Never set foot on Stall High School, but my diploma says I graduated from there. What you had to do is you had to take classes and study, and then they would give you an exam. If you passed the exam, then you got your
Mhm.
high school diploma, sort of like a
Yeah.
GED. So
Yeah.
I went to the classes and I started reading all this stuff. And I said, well, I already know all this stuff. So I just asked the people I walked up and said, hey, look, I know all this stuff. Can I just take these exams? And they kind of smirked at me and said, okay, smarty pants, we'll let you take the exams. So I spent a day just taking all those exams. And to their surprise, I passed everything except the math, which I barely missed. So I went home, studied for a couple of days, and then took the math test. Next thing you know, within 3 days or so, I've got my high school diploma. So
That's
I wasn't,
fantastic.
yeah, I wasn't a dumb kid. I just, wasn't
Yeah.
motivated to that.
Yeah. Yeah. You were more than just an average. You are more than just an average person for sure. So, what is your advice, Keith, to young people who might have dropped out of school, or to parents with children who have dropped out of high school? What would you tell them about the importance of completing that phase of their education?
For most people, dropping out of high school is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. Now, there are some people that do that and go on and drop out of high school and college and do very well. But for the average person, you're setting yourself up for a lifetime of poverty unless you've got some unique and special skills that you can use to parlay yourself into the upper economic brackets, you need a high school diploma now for just about anything to learn how to become a mechanic or something. Everything's gotten so complicated. You need to have those basic skills. And not only that, you need to have a basic civic understanding of what society is that you live in.
Yeah, that's great advice. And then you went to OCS. But so in terms of interval, you non-commissioned officer, how many times were you in rank? How many years were you in rank before OCS, Officer Candidate School?
I was at the 9.5 year mark when I got commissioned. So I had a little over 9 years when I went to officer candidate school. And that was my third attempt at getting a commission because I had gotten my high school diploma my first year in the Navy. And then a couple of years after that, I completed my associate's degree while I was in Cuba. And then when I transferred to Mayport in Florida, Jacksonville, Mayport area, I completed my bachelor's degree. And that's when I applied for officer candidate school. So I had a total.
Go ahead.
I had a total of about 9 years when I started OCS, a little over 9.
I'm impressed by that. I mean, from high school dropout, 9 years, you're in OCS. What was OCS like for you?
Considering the fact that I was, almost halfway through my Navy career, OCS was a piece of cake for me. They were teaching me stuff that I used to teach classes on. The hardest part of OCS was the celestial navigation. That almost did me in because I could not grasp the concept of using the stars and the sun to figure out where you were on Earth and then navigate from that point to another point. So you had to learn some basically three-dimensional chess to complete OCS. The first test I took in celestial navigation, I thought I knew it cold and I failed the test. And that's the first test I'd ever failed as a sailor or as an adult. So we had to go what they called stupid study. And normally that was held in a small classroom. But this time, so many people had failed that exam, they had to do it in the auditorium. So I looked around at all these smart people and said, they don't get it either. So maybe I'm not as dumb as I thought. So once I learned everything properly, I got a 100 perfect score on the next exam. And then the final exam, you had to do a day's work in navigation, basically a 3-hour exam. And I got right to the very end and I had what was a running fix and it didn't look right. And I just panicked. I started to sweat and I got lightheaded. I thought I was going to pass out. So I got up and asked the instructor if I could use the restroom. And he said yes. They followed me in to make sure I didn't commit suicide or pass out. And after I'd relieved myself, came back and wiped the sweat off my face, I sat down and looked at the exam and realized my mistake, which was I'd drawn one line in the wrong direction than what it was supposed to be. So learning to control that fear of failure and that anxiety was one of the things I learned at OCS. Didn't master it right then, but I did learn it.
Yeah. Now, look, so had you completed your bachelor's degree before then, or did you complete it after OCS?
You have to have a bachelor's degree to go to OCS. So I completed it before OCS. But before that, I'd applied for something called the enlisted commissioning program. And I didn't get selected for that. They said I had too many college credits or something like that. I forget what it was, but I didn't get selected. Oh, I know what it was. On that one, I got a negative critique appraisal from one of the people on the staff saying that I had no leadership potential. Guy I'd never met, never had a conversation with. There was not a single flaw in my service record, but he just didn't see any potential in me. So if you don't have 3 stellar recommendations, you can forget it. And then when I applied for the limited duty officer program, I was junior enough to apply, but too junior to get selected. And they told me I had too many college credits. So on one case, I have no leadership potential. On the other case, overqualified.
Overqualified, yeah.
Yeah. So I gave the Navy one more shot, and that's when I got selected for OCS.
That's fantastic. Now, but then after you retired, you weren't finished with the education. You did something else. What did you do? And
well,
why?
I got my master's degree in human resources development. I started that in my last tour, my last 2 tours in the Navy. I started that when I went to the float staff. And 3 months into that job, I'd already signed up to take classes and was taking classes and whatnot and investing in some real estate. And my boss, the chief staff officer, this crusty old Navy captain from Northeast Florida, good old boy, he calls me into his office one day and says, Keith, he said, I want you to take over the import training department. I said, no, thank you, Captain. I said, I'm happy where I am. I had been paying attention and I knew that job was a kiss of death. That job was getting all sorts of heat because he was responsible for doing training for all the ships in the basin. And part of that was putting people on report for not doing training properly or not doing it at all, and et cetera. And he would get all these irate phone calls from commanding officers trying to get promoted, and he was making it hard for them because you had to report all this stuff up to higher authority. And I wanted nothing to do with that job. He did it as a white lieutenant commander. I sure as hell didn't want to do it as a black lieutenant.
Yeah. Now, look, I mean, where is this drive coming from? I mean, what is your drive coming from? I'm still thinking about high school dropout. Now, we've already established that you got some natural talents. You're blessed with the gift. But where's this drive coming from? You're still climbing, even after you retired from the Navy.
Well, for 20 years after I retired from the Navy, I wanted nothing to do with the Navy because my final tour in the Navy was really devastating to me emotionally and career-wise. I had done exceptionally well, and then I check into my last command, and I go to work for this guy from Alabama that takes one look at me and decides I can't do the job I've been ordered in there to do. And then he assigns me a job that was of no consequence, had no real responsibilities, and that would have been the end of my career as far as promotion went. Because if I went up competing with guys that had these great jobs, et cetera, I was 2 or 3 years ahead of my peers because I stayed at sea so long and done these important jobs. But that would have been the kiss of death for me. Once he finally interviewed me and saw who I was, then he gave me not only the job I'd been ordered in there to take, but an additional department head job that was a full-time job. So now I have 2 full-time jobs in what was supposed to be an easy short duty job. But where the drive is coming from is I wanted people to understand. I saw starting about 2015, 16, we were going to enter into another one of those contentious cycles in the country regarding race relations and stuff like that. So I wanted people to understand. I knew it was eventually going to impact the military, which is why the Supreme Court is hearing a case about eliminating affirmative action programs in the military. So I knew that's where we were headed. I was in the middle of all of that during the 1980s. And then we had some of that again when Obama got elected. But I knew come the 2016 election started that it was time for me to warn people about what was coming. So I'd written the book, I'd written my first book about 2007 or 8. But once Obama got elected and we entered a post-racial society, I said, well, there's no need for this. Well, that turned out to be a bust. So what's driving me is trying to point out the fact that there are differences in the way people are treated in the military, just as there are in society. So that's my drive.
I got you. Okay. Now you mentioned certain jobs in the Navy. What were some of those jobs, your best jobs that you had in the Navy? Some of them,
well,
one or two.
I'll start off with my worst job, and then I'll go to the best. My worst job as an officer, my worst job was as an officer was my job as a chief engineer on a frigate out of Mayport, Florida. I went from a first-class yeoman, the guy that does admin, types papers and stuff, to chief engineer on a gas turbine warship in 4 years. And in that 4 years, I had no experience on a gas turbine platform. I'd had no experience in an engineering department, and I was still a frock lieutenant. There were division officers on that ship that were senior to me. So I got the worst job on that slate of assignments. I got the worst job on the list, the job nobody wanted, and I did it as the junior person in the entire 2 classes, the class before me and the class after me. So I felt like I was being set up to fail. I've had people tell me that. They were setting you up to fail. I don't know that, can't prove. They must have had a tremendous amount of confidence in me to give me that job because I didn't think I was going to survive it. And in certain respects, that really shaped who I became later. But I managed to do 22 months in that job. It's normally an 18-month tour, but the guy who followed me, who was coming in to relieve me, he failed the tactical action officer exam, which is a 3-hour exam. about war fighting and tactics and our weapons, their weapons, and all this other stuff. The reason it's 3 hours long is because if you don't do well in that, people can get killed when you're in an operational environment. So he failed that exam. So he had to roll back to the very beginning and take it over again. So I had to do 4 months of history. But that was that chapter 8 and 9 in my book is really, it's tough for people to read because it really deals with a lot of issues that people think went away in the past. And I dealt with those in the Persian Gulf and on a ship where I was the only Black officer for the entire duration of my tour. Now, the best job I had was the one that the captain gave me that I declined. And when he said, well, Keith, he says, if you don't volunteer for it, you're probably going to wind up with it anyway. You know how this works. So I asked him if I could sleep on it. And he said, yes. So I went home, slept on it, came in the next morning and volunteered. That's the way it works in the military.
Yeah.
But it turned out it was the best job I ever had as an officer because not only did he give me the job, but he gave me the backup and support that I needed to make some of the changes that needed to be made. So that's another important chapter in the book. It shows what happens when you have good leadership and they back you up. I got chewed out regularly by senior captains because they didn't like the way I was talking to them, but I was just doing my job. I went to him once and said, Captain such and such is upset because apparently because he didn't like some of the things I was saying. So he said, well, tell me what happened. So I explained it to him. And when I finished, he said, so in other words, you just didn't kiss his ass enough. I said, apparently not. He said, okay, carry on. So I had real good backup. And there were a couple other things that got real exciting. Being a captain from a shore command wanted me court-martialed because I'd come over and been disrespectful and abusive towards one of his senior officers. But he'd been fed a line of bull about what was happening. So I had to create a situation where I got all bull elephants together and let them stomp the ground a little bit. And then I could show what was actually happening. After that was done, and that captain realized his own people were lying to him, I was able to get a major project completed. And a few months later, that project that they'd been dragging their feet on was featured in Surface Warfare magazine for this outstanding self-help accomplishment where we built our own mobile wet trainer from scratch. And we were training ships on the fleet at a fraction of the cost that it was cost before they canceled this expensive wet trainer. I just said, hell, they can't, if they're not going to provide the trainer, we're just going to build one ourselves. So that was the job that was really impactful. And it was my best job in the Navy.
That's great. Hey, look, I want to play a little game with you. I'm going to ask you about some things that you learned from the Navy. I'm going to come back to your book and spend more time with it later on. But I'm just going to throw out maybe 3 things and ask, what did the Navy teach you about this? Are you willing to play that game with me?
I'm willing. I'm ready.
Okay. The first one, what did the Navy teach you, or what did you learn about leadership in the Navy?
Well, I wound up in my, when I was an Equal Opportunity Program Specialist, they started a 3-day leadership program to supplement the 2-week training that was happening on the fleet. So I became very knowledgeable in good leadership techniques, behaviors, practices, communication. I already had 18 graduate level hour college credits in communication. So I was a perfect candidate to start teaching leadership. But what I learned was French and Raven's 5 bases of power. The bases of power that leaders use to motivate and influence people. That was very helpful to me. It's one of the best things I ever learned, because I learned that being a coach was one of the best ways to lead, and being a coercive leader was one of the worst. It has positive short-term effects, but overall it leads to negative outcomes, both for the leader and the people that are being led. Eventually, they will rebel against that, just like happened in The Wizard of Oz. Once the man behind the curtain was revealed to be he was an insecure bully for the most part. But once that happened, then people, started to see, and the same thing's happening right now. The coercive leadership style is the worst one you can use. So I learned a lot about leadership because I taught it to officers and sailors on the fleet for a couple of years.
Well, those are great examples. The leader that's a coach, or a leader that can inspire, Can you think, and I don't want you to name anyone, but think of the national landscape, or let's say into the global landscape. Can you think of anyone who exhibits the qualities of a coach, an inspirer as a leader?
Well, I think Zelensky in Ukraine is a perfect example of a coach in leadership. He was offered the opportunity to be flown out of Ukraine when the Russian invasion started. He says, "No, I'm staying here with my people. I'm not going anywhere. I lead them from here. We're going to fight." He listened to his generals. They had expert power, and he listened to them. But as he got his footing underneath him, he began to exert his own decision making because he saw things from a perspective, not just from a military perspective, but from a political perspective as well. He needed to inspire his own people as opposed to just, do the cookie cutter leadership thing. So he's a very good example of someone that is leading well.
Uh-huh. That's great. Stay with the ship. That's right. Stay with the ship.
I can give you
Now,
one more example.
I'm sorry, one more example, please.
Yeah, and this is a military example. I was extremely impressed with Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, who spoke up and blew the whistle about what he saw as improper behavior. And at great risk to himself, he pointed out that, there's something unusual happening here. We probably need to look into it because it affected our collective national security. The man was vilified, run out of the military, as was his brother, and both him and General Mark Milley exhibited what I consider to be true dedication and commitment to the oath that they took to protect this nation.
Hmm. And the opposite of this, I don't recall the exact words you used. Remind us of the bad example, the more coercive intimidation. What word did you use?
Well, the word I use is just a coercive leadership style.
Coercive, right? Coercive.
Yes.
Can you think? Yeah, there's just a word, just conjures up all kinds of things for me. But can you think of any leaders globally, nationally, who may exhibit that? You don't have to use it in names, but can you do anyone? Does anyone come to mind?
Well, there's an obvious one, which I will not name, but the North Korean leader operates out of fear-based leadership. He
Mm,
killed his own uncle, had him, killed by a firing squad. Saddam Hussein is a perfect example of a coercive leader.
mm,
When he assumed control of his country, he gathered all of his senior leadership together, and he talked about the enemies within, and he talked about the need to purge these people, and he pulled a list out of his pocket, and he started naming names. They were military, they were government officials, and every time he named a name, someone would walk up and escort that person out of the hall, never to be seen again. He had him killed.
mhm,
So he instilled fear in his people by using the coercive, vindictive leadership style. But what he was doing was purging anyone that he thought might be a threat to his leadership. And that brought
mhm,
everybody else into line. Adolf Hitler did the same thing. If he could not control his generals, bribe them with position, money, power, etc., he had them killed.
mm,
So the
yeah,
coercive leadership style, as I said, is the worst possible style for long-term results. If you're in the middle
yeah.
of a battlefield, you don't have time to coach people. You order people to do things that may get them killed because it's necessary to happen. But it's good for short-term stuff. But as far as long-term, it's the kiss of death for any kind of
Yeah.
organizational effectiveness.
That's a great reminder to us all. Okay, second question, second one. What did the Navy, or what did you learn about adversity from your career in the Navy or in life?
Oh my goodness! What we got a week? I learned that adversity is coming no matter what you do. You're not going to get enough sleep. You're not going to have enough resources. You're not going to be able to convince people that are supposed to be on your team to help you. One of the things I learned was it doesn't matter what you say, it's what you can prove. So if you're facing adversity, well, I had one skipper, one XO tell me in my first tour as an officer, he pulled me aside. He'd assigned me some work that I wasn't supposed to have, so I wasn't supposed to have any collateral duties. And I was tired. And he pulled me aside and said, Keith, let me tell you something. He said, nobody cares whether you've got enough sleep or not. He said, so you make sure you get enough. He said, and you don't have to be as smart as the rest of these guys. You just do your job and you're going to be okay. I was the only Black ensign among 10 ensigns on the ship. And I had a different pedigree than all these guys. But something in me he saw, so he gave me all these opportunities to shine. So I learned that sometimes when people are giving you work beyond what you're supposed to do, it's because not because they don't like you, it's because they're trying to boost you up. But in my next tour, I was facing adversity in that my supply officer was not ordering parts that I needed that were critical for the ship to deploy on time. I talked to my captain, I talked to my XO, I talked to the department heads, I talked to him, and I couldn't get him to do his job because he didn't like me. So what I did was I said, well, I can complain all day long, but I need to show these people on paper what's actually happening. So I created a spreadsheet. I stayed up all night one night, me and one of my supply petty officers, and I created this spreadsheet with my 25 most critical parts. And by the time I was done, I showed what happened from step one to the final step and what the delays were and the shenanigans were happening in between the time I ordered the parts and today. And once I completed that list, I was astounded at how capricious this behavior was. It was intentional. So when the captain came in that morning, I'd been up all night, no sleep, no food. And I handed him that list. And I said, Captain, I've been trying to tell you what's happening here, and you have not been willing to listen. I want to go through this list, and I want to show you that if I don't get these parts soon, this ship's not going to be able to deploy on time. And you're going to have to explain that to somebody. I said, so if you don't help me, that's what's going to happen. And my next step was when I left his office, if he didn't help me, I was going to march over to the squadron and hand it to the materiel officer and say, I've done everything I can within my own organization. If you guys don't lean on my captain, this ship's not going to deploy on time. Your Commodore is going to have to explain that up the chain. And I'm not going to be left holding the bag.
Mm-hmm.
So after the supply officer came up, could not answer the captain's questions about why this was happening, he got chewed out and ordered to order every single part on that list immediately. So then I had all this work hitting me all at one time. The captain liked that so much, that report so much, he says, I want you to update this every day. And then he told me, I want you to teach all the other department heads how to do this report. So now all the guys that were blowing me off, now they have to do the same report that I did. So what I learned was adversity is best shared rather than carrying it on your shoulders all by yourself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now you used a couple of titles that I want you to underscore for us so that our listeners and our viewers would know what they are, the Navy talk. You mentioned an XO, and you also mentioned skipper. Some people may not be familiar with those titles.
Got it. Executive officer, XO, is the number 2 man in charge of an organization. He's the, if the captain, something happens to the captain, the XO is the number 2 person in charge. He's basically the administrator. He handles most of the administrative stuff that happens on board the ship, the day-to-day operation of the ship. And the captain handles the big picture stuff. So, and the skipper is just another word for captain.
Ah, I see. Got it. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Keith.
No, the captain of the ship is often referred to as a skipper.
Got it. Okay. All right. So here's the third one. What did you learn about yourself, about resilience from serving in the Navy?
I learned that you can hang on for 15 minutes at any time in any given scenario. All you have to do is hang on for the next 15 minutes. If you can do that 4 times in a row, you've made it through an hour.
Wow.
If you can do that 20 times in a row, you've made it through a good portion of your day. Nothing is so bad that you can't handle it for 15 minutes. So that's one of the things I learned, that at one point I almost quit when I was in that chief engineer tour because it was just too much. There were guys all around me just throwing in the towel that had more experience than I had and more time in the Navy than I had, and they couldn't handle it. So I just decided I'm going to tough this out. At one point, I passed out from exhaustion and stress in the middle of some engineering drills down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I hadn't had any sleep in God knows when. So I was doing these drills for a training team, and I did 2 drills. These are my first drills on real live engines. So I did 2 drills and I was fine. I was great. And all of a sudden I got lightheaded and dizzy while we were setting up for the 3rd drill. And I grabbed the rail in front of me and I was shaking my head trying to snap out of it. And the next thing I knew, I squatted down. I'm fighting as hard as I can. But the next thing I knew, I fell over backwards, hit my head on the metal deck. Nobody bothered to catch me. I'm the only Black person in the space, surrounded by people, and some of them worked with me, and some of them didn't think I had any right to be there. But it was just a very stressful situation. And when I came to and I tried to get up, the captain wouldn't let me. The corpsman was there. And so captain asked me, he said, and I hadn't been there 90 days yet. I hadn't been there 60 days yet. And the captain asked me, I said, Keith, when was the last time you had any sleep? And I looked up at him. I said, Captain, I said, I don't know. I had gone for days, it seemed like, with no sleep. And I was just physically and emotionally exhausted. So, but I learned that, I could tough that out for 15 minutes at a time. At one point, a couple months later, we were doing drills, getting ready to, we're having our operational propulsion plan examination, and whether we passed or failed that determined whether we deployed on time. And we were setting up to do drills, and we were doing drills, and one of my number 2 guy in the engineering department was doing drills. I closed my eyes, we were doing one drill, and when I opened them, we were doing another drill. So I'd fallen asleep standing up, first and only time in my life that I'd ever fallen asleep standing up. But at least this time I didn't pass out. So I learned that you just got to hang on for another 15 minutes.
Wow, I love that. That's a great teaching. 15 minutes. If you can survive that, then deal with the next 15 minutes later. I love it. That's good. Look, I want to ask you a couple of what's it like questions. What's it like living on a naval ship? What is it like? Tell us about it. What have you cared to share with us?
It is one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done, because I learned so much about myself and about life out in the middle of the ocean. You're transiting from Jacksonville, Florida to the Mediterranean, and then on your way to the Persian Gulf. And when you look around out in the ocean and all you see is stars above you and water around you, there's not even another light from another ship. It really makes you understand how small you are and how basically insignificant you are on this planet. But you get to know people. You spend months and months working with the same people. They get to know you, you get to know them. You get to see there aren't many differences between people. It's just in how they view each other. I also learned that it is vital that the U.S. military maintain a strong presence on our seas, because if they don't, you have people being forced to divert and go all around Africa just to get their goods moved. And you have people having ships boarded, goods stolen, people kidnapped, and pirates and whatnot. So the Navy is vital to our national security. But I learned a lot about dealing with people.
Okay, that's great. So now, what was it like overall being a naval officer?
It was challenging. It was informative. You learn a lot about, especially when depending on what you're in, you learn a lot about what's going on in the world, because you have to stay up to date on material that's not shared with the general public, secret and top secret information. But you learn a lot about how we fit into the system. So I would not trade my military experiences for anything. I would have preferred not to have had some of the negative experiences that I had, but I would have had those whether I was in the military or not.
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit, you did well in the Navy, and the Navy did some good things for you. Hey, look, you have the same rank as James Bond, Commander. I think that's fantastic. Now, I want to get to your book. That's one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you during February 2024, Black History Month. Black Officer, the primary title, White Navy. Firstly, why did you write this book?
Well, as I said, I looked around. I'm an avid reader. I read a lot of history. And I looked around for a book from a Black officer or sailor that talked about their career and what it was like serving from from a junior enlisted to a mid-grade officer or beyond. I read everything I could find, and there wasn't anything there that did what I was looking for. So I said, well, nobody's written it. I'll go ahead and write it. So, but that's what drove me. And I also wanted people to understand the challenges that minority officers and enlisted people face, regardless of the service they're in. They're going to face racism and discrimination in the military. The military has documented that. And if the best way to deal with that and address it is to acknowledge it, which has happened in the last few years, it goes in a cycle, like a 25-year cycle. But after you've acknowledged it, you have to put in place training programs and procedures to try to minimize that. Because the worst thing you can have is an organization where people don't trust each other and people don't support each other. I've lived that, and I know that it's detrimental not only to those individuals, but to the organization and ultimately to national security.
So one of the problems that you see in today's Navy is racial discrimination. So let me ask you this. I mean, did you observe any other forms of, discrimination? For example, I've heard some stories about women, incidents of sexual abuse in the armed forces. Did you witness any of that, or were you aware of any of that going on?
I was aware of that when I was a junior enlisted sailor. It was a blessing for me to be assigned to teach, facilitate workshops in the Navy, 77, 78. One of them was cultural expression in the Navy, which was about race relations and people from different cultures getting along with each other, communicating and so forth, leading people. The other was military rights and responsibilities, about your responsibilities as a military person to treat everybody fairly, et cetera. And another one was women in the Navy workshops. So I saw firsthand the hostility that women coming in the Navy generated from senior people and junior people who did not like the fact that women were now coming in taking jobs that had belonged to men. And so that was a very a beneficial thing to me. And then I also taught some other workshops later on in life, facilitated some other workshops. But I got to see firsthand, a lot of that.
Okay, so you've established the Navy got these problems, and you talk about it. You do some thing on social media about it. What are some, from your perspective, obviously, what are some possible solutions for these problems?
Well, the Department of Defense did a study. They went back and looked at decades worth of studies, and they found that Black sailors are more harshly punished than white sailors in the judiciary system. And Assistant Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks, there were 18 recommendations that came out of that study. She put together a list of 8 or 9 taskings that required each organization to do certain things. So first thing you have to do is acknowledge that the problem exists. And then once you've acknowledged that, you have to put in place procedures that will address that. I wrote an article with a retired Navy Captain, John Cordell, about DEI's unfinished business, the DOD's unfinished business. And we had a 10-point plan. In that 10-point plan, there were 8 specific recommendations. We did that in October of 2022. By about February or March of 2023, the Navy put forth a plan that said that they were going to create a database for equal opportunity complaints for the Navy and the Marine Corps. They were going to use that database to look for trend data and to identify areas for improvement. Those were 3 of our recommendations encompassed in that one statement. So pointing out the issues is a way to get sunlight on those. And then the organization, once they're aware of the issues, then they need to put in place, actions that are going to resolve those. I also wrote an article about making racism a uniform code of justice offense. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948, but it has not been, it still to this day is not a separate offense for behaving in a racist manner towards someone that you work with or for. And I think it's
Mhm.
past time that we've done that.
Yeah. What I hear you say is that one problem clearly is same crime, different punishment, and race is central in administration of punishment. Let me just ask you a hypothetical question. A lot is being said today about AI, artificial intelligence. What if same crime, put it into a computer database and let artificial intelligence show you what the punishment should be? Do you think that could solve some of these problems?
Well, that would never work in the military. And I can tell you, um, every commanding officer has to have a certain amount of discretion. What
Yeah.
happens is that discretion is used to more harshly punish Black people than white people. That's just a fact. I saw it
Yeah.
when I was a mass yeoman down in Guantanamo Bay, and it concerned me so much that I made a list. I had to do quarterly statistics. It showed exactly what I was seeing with my own eyes. So I created these um, standard punishments for these offenses, and I would watch consistently Black people get additional punishment added because they were challenging the racism they were facing and the disparate treatment they were receiving. So if you don't, what you're saying is great, but artificial intelligence has been shown to um, wind up discriminating against Black people because the inputs themselves are racist. And
Yeah. Yeah.
AI learns
Yeah.
to be racist because of the input that it's
Yeah.
received.
I got you. Input in, similar input out. I got you there. So, boy, this seems to be the crux of the matter, though. How do you put fairness in the administration of justice? That's the crux of the matter.
Well, first of all, you have to recognize that the unfairness exists.
Uh,
You have to question, commanding officers have to question, why are so many Black people coming up to me for these minor offenses? And I know Black people don't do anything. Black people don't use drugs at any higher rate than white people do. Actually, just a slight bit less. But look at the prison system and see see what it looks like.
yeah.
So the racism is built into the system, and it occurs at every level all along the process, and then you get the results that you have now. The wealth gap between Black and white isn't because Black people don't want to be wealthy. It's because they've had so many stumbling blocks and blockades put in their place to prevent that from happening. And then when you achieve a certain amount of wealth and you go to sell your house, and the appraiser values it at $150,000 less than a house owned by a white person, that is also built into the system.
Yeah, I hear you. Boy, that's a problem that surely needs to be solved. So now you're working on other projects. You're working on another book project. Oh, before I ask you about that though, you singled out Admiral Zumwalt. Why do you rate him highly in your talks, in your blogs, and elsewhere?
Admiral Zumwalt confronted, once he became aware of the racism that permeated his service, he confronted that with direct action, uh, demanding that certain things happen, getting rid of Mickey Mouse regulations. I mean, and he called all of his leadership on the carpet for failing to implement, his directives. So that man was the youngest CNO in Navy history. He got promoted over like 39 or 40 senior admirals. The guy that he relieved told him how to drive Black officers out of the Navy and told him that Zumwalt, so you're blackening my Navy. This guy happened to be from Alabama, and was a racist. Um, Highly respected, in the military. He went on to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, um, but he was a racist. So if the leadership isn't exhibiting the behaviors that they want to see, then guess what's going to happen? So Admiral Zumwalt, he was influenced by a guy named Lieutenant Commander William S. Norman, who is an unsung hero in the Navy. And I've been trying to get more recognition for him through the Naval Historical Center. But he was a young lieutenant commander, just like me. He went there as a lieutenant, and he wrote a resignation letter saying why he was resigning and pointing out all these problems. And when Zumwalt saw that resignation letter, there weren't many Black officers in the Navy at the time. There were fewer than 50 Black naval officers at the time when he wrote that resignation letter.
Mhm.
So Zumwalt said, I want this guy to come talk to me. Zumwalt wanted him, rather than leave the Navy, I want you to stay and help me change things. So Norman walked in there with a list of demands. I think it was 18 or 20 demands, and Zumwalt agreed to all of them on the spot. One of them was allowing Filipino sailors to go into other ratings other than just being a mess man specialist and waiting on officers. So because of Bill Norman, he was able to get Filipino sailors to be able to serve in jobs that were close to them because of their race. So not long after that, well, some of those stewards went on to become Navy captains in the Navy, as opposed to just being domestic servant, basically in the Navy. So he had a tremendous impact. Both of them had a tremendous impact on the Navy. And I also read Zumwalt's memoirs, a 19-year-old seaman, while I was in Charleston. I'd heard all about this guy, read all the Z-grams, and then I was in the library one day doing my nerd stuff, and I stumbled on Zumwalt's memoir, On Watch. And that is one of the reasons I stayed in the Navy when I was facing so many of these challenges, because I knew what he'd gone through. I said, if this guy can make it through all this stuff, then I can make it through this tour.
Fantastic. Okay, your next book project, what are you doing next?
Well, I just finished the revision of the first book. This is the third book I actually wrote. The first book, I threw it away and started again with the Black Officer White Navy version. Someone saw that, a review that was done by this Navy Captain John Cordell. So University Press of Kentucky contacted me and said, we'd like to acquire this book and republish it. They sent me a contract. I sat on it for a year. I didn't do anything. And finally, after a year, I called them and said, hey, are you still interested in this book? And they said, yes, sent me another contract. I signed it. And the rest is history. I spent months and months, over a year, revising this book. I got it down from 178,000 words to a little under 100,000, added 32 pictures, and I updated it with all of the stuff that's happened since 2017. So much of what I was talking about has been validated by both the Navy and the Department of Defense. So everything that I was saying in that book, well, the significant things that I said in my book have now been acknowledged and validated by the Department of Defense, and they are taking actions to address it.
That's fantastic. Well, good luck with the project. Down the road, do you see more projects? Do you have something else on the drawing board?
I just want to get through this thing, and I had wanted to write a book about the minority veteran experience. There's a great book called Bloods by Wallace Terry about an oral history of the Vietnam War. I'm encouraging people to tell their own stories. I'm willing to help people do that, but I may look into writing something similar to what Wallace Terry did, or I may do a book on how to survive your career. That's the other thing I want to do. Checklist for how to survive your career. These are some pitfalls you need to look for. These are some things you need to do. And it doesn't just apply to the military. It's also anybody that's trying to make it through a career. I'm real big on standard operating procedures. If you don't have an SOP, you're in trouble.
Sounds like you're going to be busy for a long time.
Well, I'm working on, I've been pretending to restore an old house for about almost 30 years. I bought it right before I retired, and I've been pretending to restore that for a long time. So that's another thing that keeps me busy.
Well, that's great. It's better to, let's see how I can put it, it's better to wear out than rust out. You want to wear out, not rust out, Keith.
There you go.
Okay. Look, is there anything else you care to share with us before we part today?
If you know anyone in the military, anyone thinking about joining the military, or if you have any family members that served in the military, if you read my book, you will learn so much about what their experiences were like. It doesn't matter, what your race is, but most Americans are disconnected from military service. So if you read and understand that, how beneficial the military can be for you, but also the price you pay for having served in the military, you'll be much better informed. I wish I had a book like mine in my pocket when I joined the Navy, so that I could use that as a checklist as I'm going along.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'm glad you were there, that you devoted so much of your life to the Navy and to this country. Thank you for being with us today, Keith.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. You've been listening to the Possibility Action Network podcast. Our guest today has been Lieutenant Commander Reuben Keith Green. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton. Until next time, good day